Hello, I'm Isabella Catelby, author of novels from Shakespeare. Welcome to my channel. Today we're going to be looking at the historical context in which Macbeth was written and how this is reflected in the play. In particular, I'm going to consider the question, did Shakespeare support the crown or was he committing treason? Shakespeare's plays straddle the reigns of two different monarchs, Elizabeth I and James I. So before we can look at the historical context, we need to know which one was on the throne when Shakespeare wrote Macbeth. In part 1 of this introduction, we discussed that the date Shakespeare wrote Macbeth is uncertain. The consensus is that he wrote it in 1606, which is early in the reign of King James I, but this is based on very shaky evidence. Some scholars believe he wrote it earlier, and will place it in the last years of the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, which means the historical context could have been very different. In either case, there was one issue that was of paramount importance, which was religion, and I'd suggest it overshadows the whole play. For anyone who doesn't know, I'll just give a brief explanation of the religious controversies during Tudor times. During the Middle Ages in Europe, everyone was Catholic, which meant that in matters of religion, everybody, including kings, was subject to the Pope. New sects did appear from time to time, but these were ruthlessly suppressed. But by the early 16th century, some people began to think that there were two particular problems with the Pope having a monopoly over the Christian Church. The first was that lots of practices had been introduced that had no justification in the Bible, such as veneration of the Virgin Mary, worshipping the relics of saints, and the idea that before going to heaven, good Catholics had to spend time in purgatory doing penance for their sins. The second problem was that the Catholic Church had used its power to become very rich. There was a particular scandal about the sale of indulgences. People bought these for themselves or for dead relatives to reduce the amount of time they had to spend in purgatory. This was how the Pope raised the money needed to build St. Peter's Cathedral in Rome. The sale of indulgences also meant the moral standards were very low, because people could do whatever they liked on earth and then buy their way out of purgatory. In 1519, a German monk called Martin Luther protested about this, and people calling themselves Protestants began to break away from the Catholic Church and form their own religious groups based solely on the teachings of the Bible. Others wanted to remain Catholics, and this became a cause of wars in Europe for the next 200 years. So how is this relevant to England? Well, Henry VIII, who was king at this time, had a quarrel with the Pope. His Spanish wife, Catherine of Aragon, had not given him a son, and he wanted to have their marriage annulled so he could marry Anne Boleyn instead. But Catherine's nephew ruled a large part of Europe, and the Pope did not want to anger him, so he refused to give the annulment. Henry's solution to the problem was to become head of the English Church himself, so that he could set the rules rather than the Pope. It also meant that he could seize the property of the Church and sell it off to make money for himself. So, during the reign of Henry VIII, church ceremonies were still Catholic. It was just that Henry was the head of the Church, not the Pope. When Henry died, he was succeeded by his son Edward VI, who was a devout Protestant. Edward insisted that church services be held in English rather than Latin, and he had images of the Virgin Mary and the saints destroyed. But Edward suffered from poor health and only reigned for 6 years. He was succeeded by his sister Mary, who was half Spanish, being the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. She was also married to the Spanish king. Mary was a devout Catholic, so the church was joined to Rome again, and Protestants were persecuted, with 300 being burnt at the stake. Fortunately for the Protestants, Mary was also in poor health and only reigned for 5 years. She was succeeded by her sister Elizabeth, who was the daughter of Henry VIII's second wife, Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth herself was Protestant, so she broke away from the Pope again and made church services Protestant. But she wanted to steer a middle course and kept some of the Catholic ritual. She also turned a blind eye if Catholics attended Mass in private. But the Catholics weren't satisfied with this. According to them, Henry VIII's second marriage was invalid and Elizabeth was illegitimate. They regarded Elizabeth's cousin, Mary Queen of Scots, the person next in line to the throne, as the true Queen of England. The Pope backed them up by announcing that anyone who obeyed Elizabeth would be excommunicated. There were many plots by Catholics against Elizabeth's life, so that they could put Mary Queen of Scots on the throne. This was not just a religious issue, as the Catholics were financed by England's enemies, Spain and France. For England to remain Protestant also meant that it would remain independent of foreign influence. With all these plots against her, Elizabeth could no longer steer her middle course in matters of religion. She had to suppress Catholicism and persecute Catholics, making them even more inclined to rebel. Meanwhile, Mary Queen of Scots had been forced to abdicate from the Scottish throne, because she had been implicated in the death of her husband, Lord Darnley. She sought refuge in England, and Elizabeth kept her prisoner in large country houses, as she was such a danger, being a figurehead for Catholic rebels. Then, in 1587, Mary was involved in a plot for Spain to invade England and set her on the throne. So Elizabeth had her put on trial for treason, and Mary lost her head. Rebellions continued for the rest of Elizabeth's reign, and as she grew older, people were nervous about what would happen when she died. She had named Mary's son James, the King of Scotland, as her successor. James himself was Protestant, and so for English Protestants it was imperative that the succession should happen smoothly, without the country descending into civil war, and possibly being invaded by France or Spain. People believed that there was a real danger, because there had recently been civil war in France for 3 years over the succession of a Protestant king, and in the end he had been forced to convert to Catholicism. James had already had attempts made on his life in Scotland, and as soon as he became King of England as well, Catholics made plots to replace him with his Catholic cousin, Arabella Stuart. The most famous of these was the Gunpowder Plot in 1605. Some Catholics intended to blow up the Houses of Parliament, causing the death of the king, his son, the whole of the Protestant nobility, and all of the members of Parliament. So now we come back to Macbeth, which is believed to have been written either in the year after the Gunpowder Plot or in the years running up to it. We can see how turbulent the times were in which it was written, and also how relevant the story is to contemporary events. There is an obvious connection with King James, as the story is set in Scotland. It is about Scottish kings, and 3 of the characters, Duncan, Malcolm and Banquo, were James's ancestors. And James himself actually comes into the play. When Macbeth has the vision of the future kings, he can see in a mirror that some of Banquo's ancestors would not only be kings of Scotland, but kings of England as well. In the play, a clear message is being given that it's against God's will for anyone to rebel against the anointed king. The day after Duncan's death, the sun does not rise because heaven is so angry. We see how Macbeth is spurred on by the witches and his wife, all of them in league with the devil. And for the remainder of the play, we see how Macbeth and his wife both suffer for what they have done. They are unable to sleep, terrified of being unmasked. They both have hallucinations, Macbeth of Banquo's ghost, and Lady Macbeth of the blood on her hands. It is made clear that there's no benefit to being a usurper. All of their friends turn against them and take part in deposing them. And when Macbeth says he'd jump the life to come, it's made clear that after their deaths they will both be going to hell. So there seems to be a very definite message in the play, that it's pleasing to God that James should rule, and that anyone who tries to overturn the established order will not only be unsuccessful, but will be acting against God's will. But we now come back to the question of when the play was written. Some scholars think that despite being about Scottish kings, Macbeth was actually written during the later years of Elizabeth's reign. Is it possible that the play is actually a warning to those who would rebel against Elizabeth? This is an interesting idea because there were so many plots against her life, and also the constant threat of invasion by Spain. So the message of the play would have been just as relevant to her reign as to James's. However, even if it was written earlier, there are some difficulties with it actually having been performed in Elizabeth's time. Plays were subject to censorship and had to be approved before they could be performed. Elizabeth forbade all discussion of her succession during her lifetime, and political prophecies were considered seditious. And although she had declared James to be her heir, this was still a sensitive issue. Before she died, there was a plot to depose her and put James on the throne instead. Courtiers who were faithful to Elizabeth, but knew she would not live much longer and wanted to prepare for the new reign, had to correspond with James secretly, using spies and code names. Therefore it's very likely that a play containing a prophecy predicting that a Scottish king would rule England would have been considered treasonous. So my guess would be that even if there are reasons to think the play was written earlier, it would have been done to facilitate James's succession, and would not actually have been performed until he came to the throne. There are all sorts of other historical references, which we'll look at in the next broadcast. In particular, we'll consider whether people in those times really did believe in witches, and thought that they interfered in political matters. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you did, please would you like, share and subscribe so YouTube suggests it to other people. Until next time, goodbye.